Markets are still moving, prices update continuously, charts refresh, trades clear without interruption. From the outside, nothing looks broken. But when prices move now, they don't seem to settle. They don't hold their ground the way they used to. Information arrives, price reacts, and then it loosens, it drifts. It gives back ground without a fight. It's not volatility, it's not panic, and it's not a lack of activity. Something else has changed. There used to be a moment after a move where price stopped, where it felt defended, where disagreement had weight. That moment is harder to find now. Prices still move, but fewer participants are willing to say, this level should hold. That process, the one where prices settle into place, that's what price discovery actually is, and it's quietly behaving differently. For a long time, price discovery was not something people needed to define. It was not discussed explicitly because it was embedded in behavior. It existed as a shared understanding rather than a formal process. Participants did not have to agree on what price discovery was. They simply acted in ways that produced it. Price discovery happened when informed participants were willing to commit capital because they believed the price, however imperfect, reflected reality closely enough to stand behind. Not indefinitely, not without risk, but with enough conviction to absorb disagreement. That willingness mattered. It mattered because prices carried weight. When price moved, it wasn't merely reacting to something external. It was asserting something internally. It reflected judgment, not just motion. It compressed competing views into a single reference point that others could respond to. For most of modern market history, institutions played a central role in this process. They were not just large participants. They were not just active traders. They were reference builders. They made two-sided markets when uncertainty was high. They absorbed temporary imbalances that others avoided. They stepped in when prices drifted too far from underlying conditions, not because they were certain, but because someone had to be willing to take the other side. When price diverged from fundamentals, institutions were often the first to respond. They acted before consensus formed, before narratives settled, before comfort returned. They accepted the risk of being early because early participation was part of the role they played. That role gave prices memory. Levels mattered because someone defended them. Breaks mattered because someone conceded them. Moves carried meaning because someone was willing to stay exposed long enough for disagreement to resolve. This role did not disappear suddenly. There was no announcement, no regulatory line crossed, no visible exit. It simply became less attractive to perform. Constraints changed, incentives shifted, the cost of early commitment rose while the benefits thinned. The environment stopped rewarding the kind of participation that made discovery robust, so institutions adapted. They didn't withdraw from markets. They didn't stop trading. They didn't reduce activity in any obvious way. They stopped doing one specific thing. They stopped being first. They stopped being the participants who establish price when uncertainty is unresolved. They stopped stepping in before confirmation appeared. They stopped absorbing ambiguity on behalf of the system. Instead, they began to wait. Waiting doesn't look dramatic from the outside. Markets don't freeze when institutions wait. Prices continue to print. Volume continues to flow. Transactions still clear smoothly. The system keeps moving, which is why this change is easy to miss. But the character of movement changes. When institutions wait, price still moves, but for different reasons. Moves become less about conviction and more about flow, less about valuation and more about positioning, less about belief and more about reaction. The market becomes responsive rather than assertive. Price answers what it is asked, but it stops asking questions of its own. That is when price discovery begins to thin. You don't notice it immediately. There is no single moment where it becomes obvious. Instead, it appears in patterns that feel vaguely unsatisfying but hard to name. An earnings report surprises expectations. Price jumps and then fades. A data release shocks consensus. Price moves and then drifts back. A narrative takes hold. Price follows briefly, then loses momentum. Not because the information lacked importance, not because participants were unaware, but because fewer participants were willing to say, this changes value enough for me to stay exposed beyond the reaction. So price moves, tests, and releases, again and again, like pressure applied to a surface that yields easily, then resets. Nothing malfunctions. Liquidity remains present. Execution remains smooth. Spreads remain orderly. That's why this phase attracts so little attention. The market still feels alive. But aliveness is not the same as discovery. Discovery requires commitment. It requires participants who are willing to remain exposed even when price hesitates, even when validation is delayed, even when clarity has not yet arrived. That willingness is the first thing institutions remove when conditions tighten, not because they are fearful, not because they lack capital, but because early commitment no longer offers sufficient compensation, so they wait. And waiting reshapes the market quietly, almost invisibly. Prices begin to behave differently, they update quickly, they reverse easily, they do not defend themselves. Moves feel provisional, temporary, conditional. You begin to notice that trends struggle to persist without constant reinforcement, that breakouts require repeated attempts, that reversals flicker instead of settling. Price still travels, but it no longer seems to remember where it has been. The market stops arguing with itself the way it used to. There is less friction, and friction, uncomfortable as it can be, was where discovery once lived. When institutions stepped in early, prices slowed. They met resistance. They forced participants to reveal conviction. And in that tension, information emerged. Now price glides more freely. It still responds to flows. It still reacts to narratives. It still moves when capital shifts. But fewer participants are willing to say that any particular level deserves to hold. So prices feel lighter, easier to push, easier to reverse, harder to anchor. This is not instability, it is softness. And softness, once it appears, has a way of spreading. As this softness spreads, behavior adapts. Not suddenly, not collectively, quietly, one decision at a time. Positions are sized smaller, time horizons shorten, exposure is treated as temporary by default. Entries are planned with exits already in mind, not because participants expect failure, but because reversibility becomes the priority. Risk is managed before it is taken. This adjustment is rational, it is disciplined, it is appropriate to the environment, but it also compounds. Because as more participants behave this way, the burden of price discovery grows heavier, and fewer are willing to carry it. The market does not lose participants, it gains efficiency. What it loses is anchoring. Other forces begin to fill the space left behind. Systematic strategies expand their influence. Momentum models respond to movement without questioning it. Passive allocation reallocates capital on schedule, indifferent to nuance. Short-term statistical edges replace longer-term judgment. None of this is a failure. None of it is accidental. These strategies do exactly what they are designed to do in an environment where conviction is expensive and reversibility is prized. But they do not discover price. They respond to it. They amplify motion rather than establish meaning. As these forces take on more weight, the market becomes increasingly sensitive but less opinionated. It reacts quickly, but it does not settle. Prices adjust rapidly, but they do not assert themselves. Moves feel more frequent, but less decisive. Prices begin to resemble suggestions rather than conclusions. This is where the change becomes perceptible to those who watch closely. Levels stop behaving the way they once did. Support feels provisional. Resistance feels negotiable. Price revisits areas that were supposedly resolved, not because something new has emerged, but because nothing held firmly enough to exclude them. Breakouts lose their authority. Reversals lose their finality. Ranges lose their meaning. There is more activity but less resolution. The market still functions, it clears trades, it processes information, it reflects flows. But its language shifts. Price stops saying, "This is value," and starts saying, "This is where we are for now." That difference is subtle, but it matters, because everything else, volatility, liquidity, and confidence, rests on price discovery. They are downstream effects. They respond to how meaning is established at the base layer. When discovery weakens, the foundation becomes lighter without becoming unstable. That is why this phase attracts so little attention. There is no panic, no disorder, no visible stress. The system appears calm. But calm is not the same as grounded. A grounded market resists. It pushes back. It forces participants to defend positions. It creates friction that reveals conviction. A calm market simply moves. Price without discovery is motion without orientation. It still travels, it still changes, but it no longer explains itself. Institutions recognize this shift. That is why they do not rush back in to restore the role they once played. They adapt instead. They trade around price rather than through it. They wait for confirmation rather than create it. They observe flows before committing. From their perspective, this is prudence. From the outside, it looks indistinguishable from normal participation. But the function they once served, absorbing uncertainty to stabilize reference, is no longer being performed in the same way. And when a role fades quietly, the system reorganizes around its absence. Price becomes more tentative. Meaning becomes more temporary. Memory shortens. The market becomes a place of continuous adjustment rather than decisive judgment. Nothing breaks, nothing fails. There is no moment when someone declares that discovery has weakened. No threshold is crossed publicly. No signal flashes. There is only a gradual change in texture. Moves feel lighter. Conviction feels conditional. Levels feel less absolute. Participants learn to treat price as provisional. Useful, but not authoritative. Informative, but not decisive. This does not create instability by itself. It creates flexibility. But flexibility without anchoring has consequences for how information is absorbed, how risk is expressed, and how meaning accumulates over time. The market becomes more adaptable, but less definitive. This is not an endpoint, it is a condition, a quiet rebalancing of roles. You can operate in this environment, you can trade within it, you can allocate across it, you can analyze it, but you cannot rely on price to behave the way it did when discovery was deeper. That is the difference. Nothing dramatic announces itself. The market continues to move. Fewer participants are willing to say what that movement represents beyond the immediate moment. And that absence, subtle, persistent, and easy to dismiss, is what quietly reshapes everything built on top of it. As this condition persists, it begins to shape perception as much as behavior. Participants stop asking whether price is right or wrong and start asking whether it will hold long enough to matter. Attention shifts away from valuation and toward durability. The question is no longer what is this worth, but how long will this level survive? That shift is subtle. It does not announce itself, but it changes how information is processed. News arrives, and instead of anchoring price, it produces a reaction. Price responds, adjusts, and then waits. Not because the information was absorbed completely, but because there is no longer a strong impulse to settle its meaning. Information becomes something the market passes through rather than something it incorporates. This is what a market without anchors feels like. Not chaotic, not unstable, just unresolved. Price becomes lighter, not because participation has declined, but because commitment has become conditional. Fewer participants are willing to stay exposed long enough for disagreement to resolve. Fewer are willing to insist that a price should hold once it has been reached. So prices drift more easily, they revisit old ground, they hesitate where they once decided. None of this produces urgency. From the outside, it still looks like normal trading. The screens are active, the charts are familiar, the rhythms remain recognizable. That is why this phase often goes unnamed. But the difference is there. Price no longer feels like a verdict, it feels like a placeholder. The market continues to function, but it no longer insists. And because it does not insist, it teaches participants a different lesson, that prices are provisional, that levels are negotiable, that movement does not require resolution. This lesson reinforces itself. As more participants internalize it, they behave accordingly. They hesitate to defend positions, they exit sooner, they wait longer, they treat exposure as something to be revisited rather than something to be maintained. Over time, this reshapes the emotional tone of the market. Confidence does not disappear, it becomes conditional. Conviction does not vanish, it becomes temporary. The market becomes a place of continuous adjustment rather than collective judgment. This does not create failure, it creates distance. Distance between price and meaning. Distance between movement and commitment. Distance between information and conclusion. That distance is what defines this moment. Nothing has broken, nothing has been lost. But something foundational has thinned. Price still moves, but fewer participants are willing to stand behind what it says. Institutions understand this better than anyone. That is why they do not rush to fill the gap. They adapt their behavior to the environment rather than trying to restore what no longer fits. They observe more. They commit less. They wait for conditions that reward anchoring again. Until then, price continues to travel lightly. It responds quickly. It reverses easily. It settles rarely. The market remains calm, but it no longer feels grounded. And because there is no single moment where this change becomes obvious, it rarely draws attention. There is no announcement, no headline, no clear signal that something has shifted. There is only a gradual recognition, among those who watch closely, that prices behave differently now. They move without insisting. They change without concluding. They update without remembering. This is not an endpoint. It is not a warning. It is simply the first place where the absence of a stabilizing role becomes visible. Before stress, before volatility, before anything that demands a response, the market is still moving. But fewer participants are deciding what that movement means. And that quiet absence, unremarkable, persistent, and easy to ignore, is the earliest place where the structure begins to feel different.